happens all the time.
Um, off of the back of your book jacket, it says that you're the associate professor in religious studies department at Guilford College, that you're a cultural historian of American religion who's published scholarships focused on gender and sexuality, resistance to authority, social justice, especially in Roman Catholicism and Mormonism. And I'm sure there's much more, so please, add whatever else you'd like to add, but I just want to speak on behalf of the community of St. Hildegard and say welcome, and we're so honored to have you here with us today. So,
thank you, Shannon. Hi, everybody. Excuse me. It's really nice to be here. I'm drinking hot tea for like the first time in months because it is rainy and 70 degrees here in Durham. It's been 100 plus with the heat index. So I'm enjoying like one of these cozy type days, and it's actually nice to sit here with a book and community and tea and just to think about having a conversation. So thank you for inviting me. A quick disclaimer, there may be barking. I have a dog who thinks he protects the house. So if you hear him, that's Phineas. And I have two cats, one who often likes to walk here. So I'll try to stop that from happening, but I've taught enough classes on Zoom that, sometimes you just go with the flow. So that may happen. So yeah, I consider myself a cultural historian, and the research that I do, I like to use ethnography as my methodology, which really means it's sort of like interviews plus. Like, in order to get information, I want to talk to people and understand where they're coming from. I want to hang out in the spaces where they are hanging out. I want to see the kinds of things they're creating and that they're doing. And that dovetails perfectly with what's going on with this book. I have my copy right here. I was drawn to this topic, and I'll say a little bit more about the specifics of this topic, but one of the things that really drew me in early on to talking about and studying and trying to understand what I call the Roman Catholic women priest movement. We could have a debate whether it should still be called a movement at all, but I called it a movement. One of the things that really was getting at me early on was this understanding that people were making claims about women priests and what they were doing without ever talking to the women themselves. There was no attempt to really understand. Now I see myself too big, but that's okay. I'm going to try to ignore that. There was no attempt to really understand where they were coming from and what was motivating what was going on and what actually was happening beyond like a soundbite or like a glimpse into an image. So I wanted to correct that. Like, my scholarship, and I am increasingly pulled toward this just in my own academic life and as a teacher. If somebody is saying something that is flat out untrue, I feel like they're going to want to know what is true. So I try to get that information and try to provide it. Here's a hint. Sometimes people don't actually want to know what's true, but that's a whole separate problem. But I am very interested in talking to people, seeing what they're doing, and trying to understand where they're coming from. And that was really what I did with this book. I talked to a bunch of women priests. I went to their masses. I went to baptisms. I went to ordinations. I hung out in house churches. I can picture sitting in living rooms with 5 other people and sharing Eucharist and having a little party after. I went to churches out in California and listened and talked to people, just tried to inhabit their spaces. And you learn a lot from doing this. You learn a lot about what people are actually doing beyond, like, sort of like beyond the headlines, to use a cliche. So that's how I got drawn into this particular project. And there's more of that going on. I mean, I just last week was in Berkeley, California, on a panel, and we were celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Danube Seven. The Danube Seven was the first ordination in what would become Roman Catholic women priests. It was 7 women, mostly European women, 1 American German woman, who were ordained by bishops on a boat. You may know this story already, who were ordained. They had hands laid on them. And this was the first 7. They called themselves the Danube Seven. So I was on a panel that was celebrating the 20th anniversary of that. And that panel and your event that you all had, was that like 2 or 3 weeks ago now, that where you were hosting Dagmar and Christine? Like, that was awesome. That's another 20th anniversary event. So, these events, I feel like in some ways, we're still having some of these same conversations, which is great to clear up the air, to clear up where there's confusion. And in some ways, and where I hope we can go in our talk today, what I hope will be a conversation as much as it's me sharing, I want to see how we can start moving these conversations forward. So 20 years ago was the Danube 7. My book's been out a couple of years. Women priests, over 250 of them have been ordained around the world. Where do we go from here? And that's one of the questions that I have, and I don't think I'm alone in that. So that's sort of the scope. I'll give you a little bit of the book, where it came from, some of my focuses in the book and where I think that's relevant, and then maybe some conversations with you all on like, where can we go? Like, where do you think this can actually go? What do you all as Catholics have the energy for? If you have the book, awesome. I'm not trying to sell the book, but I do think it's good and I'm proud of it. If you have it, you would notice that the epigraph, which I'm trying to find to read to you, the dedication, not the epigraph, I dedicated it. I wrote, "For today's Catholics, especially those who seek answers yet cling to mystery." I felt it was important to name that so many people who identify as Catholic are struggling to put the world as they see it in conversation with the faith as it's been given to them, and what creative work can happen in that intersection. And that's what I kept seeing. I mean, the title of this book is Transgression and Tradition. Those things are like diametrically opposed. We should see them as diametrically opposed. And yet with RCWP, they're together. And sort of like, I'm picturing a Venn diagram. So what's happening in that intersection? And that's just how I think about this movement and how I think about the world we inhabit. We're told certain things and it doesn't always add up with the world in which we find ourselves. So how do we make those things? How do we creatively and faithfully make sense of that? Before I read a few passages, I just wanted to share how I came about this study. It's a sort of fun story. So it was the fall of 2007, which was 15 years ago now, which is sort of mind blowing. And I was in a seminar. I was in graduate school at UNC Chapel Hill. I already had a master's degree from Harvard Divinity School, a Master of Theological Studies. And then I wanted to go on to get a PhD. So I went to UNC Chapel Hill for that. Because that was a great place to study American religious culture, which is what I do and what I wanted to do. And I was in a Catholicism seminar, and it was late October, and I needed a final paper topic. If you can imagine the stress of like, first week of December's coming up, and I've got a 20-page paper due, and I don't have a topic yet. So I'd been playing with all these different topics for this seminar, which was a sort of a history of American Catholicism seminar. And around this time, somebody sent me some newspaper clippings, because this was even before like I had a smartphone and someone would just text me like a newspaper link. So they sent me newspaper clippings and like, have you heard about these women getting ordained in St. Louis? Now I am from St. Louis, Missouri. I lived there through high school, and I've gone back a couple times to live there. So I read about these women, Elsie McGrath and Rosemary Hudson, who were women in their late 60s, who were about to be ordained through this movement, this initiative, this group. I hadn't heard of them. They were calling themselves Roman Catholic Womanpriest, and they had a female bishop named Patricia Friesen, and they were going to be ordained in all places in a Jewish synagogue in downtown St. Louis. And I've been in that synagogue many times because I have relatives. I was raised Catholic, but I'm a quarter Jewish. My mom was half Jewish. So I'm like, I know these people. I know the Jewish people. I know their rabbi, Susan Talvey, who has said to the women, Elsie and Rosemary and Patricia, like, yeah, come on, use our temple as a sanctuary for your ordination. And this was controversial. So there were, all this fighting. Our Archbishop, Raymond Burke, who nobody who was progressive liked at all. And some of his people, they were just like really attacking, of course, these women who were going to get ordained. They were attacking Susan Talvey, the rabbi. And I just got drawn into this story. And I was like, I went to my professor, like, can I write on this? Can this be my seminar paper? Yes, okay, that's fine. This can be your seminar paper. So it became a seminar paper. And as I was just working on this, it was some of the things that I'd already shared with you, like there were so many misunderstandings, people saying things that were just not accurate or not honest, or like a spin and a twist that I just didn't think was really very fair at understanding who was moving this movement and what they were doing and why. So I didn't intend to make this seminar paper my dissertation project, but it became my dissertation project. So going from a 20-page paper due for a class to basically a 400-page research project that would go on for years. That was my dissertation. How did that happen? Well, because I had tremendous difficulty getting into Catholic archives to do the other projects I proposed. So that's just an institutional sexism right there. I've since learned that this is not uncommon. If you're familiar with Phyllis Zagano, she's a brilliant scholar of Catholicism, theologian, historian, all of that. She's written a ton of books, and she confirmed for me on a panel last November, we were on it together. Like, she was like, oh yeah, like the Archbishop can block certain people from using Archdiocesan archives. They can just have a rule of who can go in. I wasn't blacklisted like as myself, but no, you only let in certain people. And a lot of times you don't let in people if they're not connected to the institutional church. Well, how many women are connected to the institutional church in a way that's going to be approved by the Archbishop and his minions running the archives? So I couldn't do the projects that I wanted. And I kept in the back of my mind, like, well, there are these women priests and they really are good at talking to me. They're willing to talk to me. And I still think their story is not fully told or understood. So I was drawn toward this topic, and it became a topic I could do and I wanted to do. And so that's sort of how I found this. Why is all of this relevant? Well, like I said, here it is sexism. Here it is sort of following a call in some ways. I've never been called to priesthood, but I felt increasingly called to do this project, in large part to right the wrongs I was seeing in print elsewhere about RCWP. And also just this need to creative problem solve around the circumstances that we're given. And I feel like that's RCWP to a T, and where the movement still is, or where the group still is. All right, so I write this book. There's a lot of sexism in getting this published. I will spare you some of that right now, but it is hard. I recognize also that I have written about one of the most controversial topics in the Catholic Church. And so when people say to me, oh, you should go work for a Catholic university, or there's this great small Catholic college down the street from your parents, why don't you go work there? I'm like, no one will hire me if they are in any way conservative or traditional or toe any sort of diocesan or Vatican line. Like I've sort of written myself out of future jobs. It's okay, I guess. But these things still are happening. So tradition and transgression, again, like I'll remind you, I don't have visuals for you. I just have the book. So much of what I do in this book, what I see myself doing is sort of this, there are these spheres that are sort of dancing around each other. Sometimes they're in conflict. Sometimes they're like magnets drawn together, and sometimes they're like repelling each other. But that's what RCWP is doing. So there's a constant, like, you could use the term dialectic. I like tension and conflict, but tradition and transgression is sort of the first one and the big one that comes up in the book. What is this group? Like, they're saying one thing, but they're doing this. How does this all fit together? So I have a few paragraphs marked from the intro that I will read for you to set some of the stage of what I'm getting at here. I've just laid out this context in the intro. I've just laid out this context of, okay, so vocations are dropping, generally speaking, and have been since the 60s. There's a sex abuse crisis, and people are leaving the church in droves. The only way the numbers in the church are staying stable in the United States at all is because of immigration. And when you do polling of Catholics, not just in the US, but also in Europe and in other parts of the world, you get people saying, yeah, we'd be okay with women priests. 50 plus 60, even 70% of people polled are saying, yeah, we could have women priests. So into this context, I write, into this contentious context steps Roman Catholic women priests, RCWP. RCWP agitates for women's ordination and stands out from its activist predecessors. Women priests do not ask for permission to become priests, they just do it. Rome disagrees with Roman authorities both historically and pragmatically. The group invokes scholarship attesting to women's ordination in early Christendom and argues that a return to ordained female leadership and married clergy is a common sense way of addressing the current problem of declining vocations. Women priests believe that they must defy the official Catholic teaching that only men can be priests in order to restore and redeem the Roman Catholic Church. Women priests' actions are designed to be controversial because they are constructing a new model of priesthood that invites new models for being Roman Catholic. The group's very existence is an ongoing protest against official Catholic doctrines and offers an alternative Roman Catholic Church in the bodies of women priests. Lots of themes being laid out there of what's going to come later in the book. I'll read a bit more. Women priests do what they do because they hold two separate and seemingly opposing beliefs. While they believe that Roman Catholic traditions are too precious to lose, they also believe that Catholic women deserve the opportunity to serve the church through the ministerial priesthood. By getting ordained illegally and disobeying Vatican teachings, women priests are declaring that sacraments are important, priesthood is important, and the Roman Catholic faith is important. Quite simply, the RCWP movement believes that positive change for Roman Catholicism demands the inclusion of women in the priestly office. As ordained women who see the official church rejecting their calls and their claims to priesthood, women priests carry in their bodies, their histories, their educations, their ministries, and their sacramental actions, a multitude of tensions confronting the contemporary Catholic Church. I also like the word tension. Whereas tens of thousands of American Catholics who want gender reform have left the Roman Catholic Church altogether, RCWP's women have stayed. Whereas tens of thousands of Roman Catholics, horrified by the sex abuse crisis and frustrated by Rome's slow pace of change, have turned to Protestant Christianity, women priests have doubled down on the value of Roman Catholicism. Whereas older generations of Catholics are some of the most conservative in the US Church, these female, mostly baby boomers, are outspoken agitators working to change their church. Whereas other Catholic feminists have used academic and theological arguments to challenge Roman authority, RCWP's women have put protest action front and center. In short, women priests are distinctive, and they offer a window into the most fraught discussions within Western Roman Catholicism today. As I argue throughout the book, and here's my thesis paragraph, RCWP straddles tradition and transgression, sometimes strategically, sometimes unintentionally. By ordaining women as priests, the group defiantly transgresses canon law and Roman Catholic tradition. Yet as priests, transgressively ordained, the women enact many traditional elements of Catholic worship. RCWP picks and chooses which elements of their faith tradition to emphasize and which to jettison. Of course, all Catholics and all religious people do this picking and choosing, whether they recognize it or not. Women priests are significant because they do this as priestly leaders of their vision for Roman Catholicism. This dialectic of the traditional and the transgressive marks RCWP's complicated relationship with the Roman Catholic Church, but it also, and this is the reason for the book, makes RCWP an invaluable case study for how all people of faith navigate vast, internally diverse traditions and handle religious change, particularly when they are in some ways marginalized within their faith communities. So those are the key parts of the introduction that I'm laying out. And then I move into chapters, and I mean, it's very simple. Sometimes chapters are long and complex, and there's hidden meaning in the titles. I'm pretty straightforward here. And I lay out the key themes that I see, and I can show this to you. I'll read it to you in a second. I didn't have visuals prepared. These are my visuals. So the way I describe the book structure is concentric circles moving outwards. So starting sort of from like individuals and individual stories to sort of history and the conflict and the culture today, to ordination ceremonies, to the sacraments. You know, ordination is included in sacrament. Then we move out to sacrament. Then we move out to ministry. And then the final concentric circle, the big one that's encompassing all of the themes and all of the chapters, is bodies. I'll probably say this again, it'll probably come up in Q&A, but I firmly believe that the key issue and the importance of this is around whether women can model Christ. Can women stand in the body of Christ, in the person of Christ, in the role of priest? I think that is essential for the Catholic Church, and I also think it is essential for many of our social issues today, outside of the church, but impacted largely by so many Catholics, whether they're on the Supreme Court or in our country. This is still a majority Catholic country. I shouldn't say majority Catholic country. It's still the biggest denomination, if we're going to call Catholics a denomination. So there's still a lot of Catholic power, even if Catholics do not speak. We know this. You all know this. Catholics do not speak with a unified voice in the culture, in politics. So it comes back to me to bodies. Who can image Jesus and how? So that's something that's personal to me in thinking about it theologically and Christologically, but I'm not alone in that. So each of my chapters focuses on attention. Womanpriest will say, though the first chapter is called, and I try again here, I start the book with, let's listen to the stories of people who you probably haven't listened to. You might have read a newspaper article in your local diocesan paper, or you might have seen a headline, or your local bishop might have said, please don't ever go to the masses by these women. You would be putting your soul in danger. I will say, I don't think I put this in the book. I have a friend, a very good friend from high school, who became a Jesuit. And when I saw him once, since I started this research, and he made clear that he thought my soul was in danger for studying this movement, for putting myself in proximity with women who would defy the church in this way. And as obnoxious and patronizing as I found that, I was really glad I heard it, because it put things in context for me in a way that I had allowed myself to be like, well, they do the ordaining. I just show up and take some notes with my voice recorder. I listen to things and then try to replicate stories. But no, in fact, for observers of even my research, I mean, I wrote a book. To me, it seems so easy. Theologically easy, but no, that put me in the crosshairs apparently. So I just find that really fascinating. Anyway, I start the book with these called narratives. Like, if you haven't listened to women priests talk about why they're doing what they're doing, you should. So here's a chapter on it. My point in that first chapter is, listen to these voices, but listen to how the women priests are, even with their call narrative, shifting the story and shifting the authority. It's not, I feel, and it's also not Rome calls me, it's God calls me. It's like, we're going to bypass the Rome calling, which I know you think is a big deal, Rome, because it's in your canon law and you're using it against us as an argument, but we're going to go straight to God because we know God is calling us. And so there's even a fascinating tension. We're going to use the language of call. We're going to use some of the same moves and maneuvers that male Catholic priests might make, but we're going to credit God. And so it's this tradition and transgression. And so that goes on throughout the book in ways that I hope complicate the movement. And it's not just sort of a hagiography of women who get ordained. I worked hard to look like I was being critical, because I was told several times, like, this book is too much celebrating the women priests. And I'm like, but nobody gets them right. And that pisses me off. So we found a happy medium. So throughout, I'm trying to point out that there is tension. I also think that makes the movement richer, and it gives more credence to the women and their arguments that they're complicated. This isn't simple. We shouldn't treat it as simple, even if maybe some of the calls are, it's simple. God has called me. Like that actually is sort of purely beautiful, I think. But it wades into some really interesting discourse. Another tension that I point out is in my chapter on ministry and how much the church is doing, how much women priests are doing ministerially. And one of the tensions I point out there is the movement likes the rhetoric of margins. Like, there's marginality. We are on the margins. We are marginalized by the church. And yet using that language gives power to the movement. By saying we are on the margins, it sort of attracts. It's like a magnet that draws in other marginalized communities and allows them from the margins to claim help from other groups. So in that chapter, I talk about, well, a lot of Protestant churches are happy to ordain women, and they are much more friendly to the RCWP movement ecumenically than they might be to the Roman Catholic Church that continues to have an idea of we are the one true church. So we can work with you, but just know that we're always right. Well, RCWP doesn't really inhabit that same attitude towards other religious traditions. So there's a power in the margins, is what I'm saying. So the idea of margins is we are powerless here, and yet RCWP claims power from it, which is fascinating. I think it's interesting. And then my final chapter, I'll start wrapping up in a minute because I'd love to hear from you all and hear some of your thoughts and questions. But my final chapter is on bodies, because like I said, if we're moving out concentrically, bodies encompasses all of it. The theology of bodies, the practice of bodies, the gendering of bodies, and stepping into the priesthood. So the tension I identified here is the movement from its early days is saying we need women to be priests because there are two genders. And just as men and wife make a perfect couple, we need a woman to do the things that women can do as wives and mothers, but we need to do them for the church. So there's this idea, this argument from gender stereotypes and traditional gender roles. And yet the women priest movement also at times is trying to undercut the need for any sort of gender identification with priesthood. But it's not about gender. It's not about gender identity at all. It's really about who we are and how we do priesthood, who we serve. It's imaging Christ as a woman from some arguments, or as a priest independent of gender. So that is also a place of tension. This is one of the areas that is really fascinating to me. I got to spend time on that panel last week in Berkeley, the commemoration of the Danube 7, with Reverend Corey, who is a non-binary priest who works for a church started by the RCWP movement, Mary Mother Apostle Catholic Community. I think I got that right. MMACC, everything's an acronym in my head, in San Diego. And so this is sort of the first publicly identified non-binary priest. So there's an opportunity to queer priesthood and explode gender binaries. So, but seriously, Corey was ordained like the month my page proofs went in. So I fought to get a sentence and a footnote into the book last minute. But so there's still much more to come, I think, from the movement on that front. I end with a conclusion that is both celebratory and cautious. And what I hope I've done is give people who care about the movement, who care about the future of Catholicism and women's role in it or not, and also maybe some of the women priests, some things to think about. As the movement has grown, it still is not drawing huge numbers of people. It's still largely small communities, It's mostly small communities. And these are, from what I've observed, incredibly tight-knit, supportive, loving communities, but they're not large. The movement also, and I was texting with Father Ann, if you know Father Ann, right before this. And one of the things I was saying to Father Ann is, I don't even know that I would call RCWP a movement anymore. Like, I don't know that it's still moving. And one of the things I'm seeing is that the group has so many pieces and everyone's kind of doing their own thing. So for it to be a movement in my mind, you need to be moving, like maybe on the same bus, maybe on the train, different cars, but you're moving somewhere. And I don't know that that's still happening. I'm concerned that it may not be happening. And with that comes like, what charism is there? Like, what do we share? Is there something that we all have identified that we agree on? And that hasn't happened. And I think people are doing it individually at this point within the movement. And that's something that's interesting. I don't know how you keep moving forward without that. And maybe you just move forward to small groups, but I don't know if it's still a movement. And I also sort of wonder at this point, what is still, I think there might be some merit to wondering if Catholics today who celebrate RCWP, and I've talked to plenty of people, like, I mean, I can picture a cruise ship. I was on a family cruise having lunch with random people, because they do that, right? At a cruise, if you've been on one, they just seat you places. And talking to them about this movement and my research. And they were like, this is great. This is fascinating. They were from Boston. And they were like, and I was like, there's women priests near you. You can go, I can give you their names. And they're like, yeah. And they were Catholics. I should make that clear. They were Catholics, which is why they let me go on for as long as they did about this. But they were like, yeah, no, we don't really go to church anymore. You know, we go some Easter and Christmas, special occasions, but that's great that they're doing this. But they weren't interested in going. And I was like, okay, but you're like their audience. So what is it? Like, how has Catholicism lost you? And I feel like there's a lot of those folks that Catholicism is kind of lost. And I don't know how, I mean, it's not my job to fix it, but I'm not quite sure how to think through that. So anyway, I see hands are starting to come up, so that's good. I can stop talking and let you all talk. But I do hope, if you find this sort of stuff interesting, that you will check out the book, not because I'm pushing the book, but because I think there's a lot of cool stuff in there that if we think through it and talk through it as Catholic communities invested in these questions, maybe we make movement, which I think is not happening right now. So anyway, I'll stop and I'll let Shannon jump in because I see her face. Go ahead. Muted.
Gotcha.
Can I just call on people? I'm trying to.
You can. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you now.
Okay, great. Yeah, that would be fine. I just want to first say thank you, Jill. It was a beautiful summary and synopsis. I have to tell you, I love your writing in your book. The chapter with Cardinal Burke was hysterical, by the way. I just very much enjoyed reading that.
Thank you. I'm glad you laughed about that, because we should. It's
yeah,
absurd.
I mean, you do. You either laugh or you cry, and I
Yeah.
choose to laugh wherever possible.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to tell you, as I was reading through it, you know, I read it when it first came out, and then I reread it for this talk. You just, like, you hit everything right on the head. I mean, as I read, I thought, you know, you're spot on in terms of the strengths, the weaknesses, I mean, so your research is just outstanding. So I did want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, because we need that, because like you said, it is so fractured in so many ways. There's not a cohesiveness to this movement or group or whatever you would like to call it. And so your book sort of, in my mind, pulls some of it together in some sort of cohesive history. And so thank you for that, and for the amount of time and the sacrifice. As you said, you know, you've not only invested so much of your time and your own personal resources and all that, but you've also put yourself in a position where, you know, you may not be able to obtain jobs that you would have otherwise, not because of your competency or your skills, but because of your topic. And so again, it reminds me of today's gospel with, you know, the priest and the Levite crossing the street to not get too close to, you know, to the man and be deemed unclean. So so thank you for that. But yes, we'll go through, and so we'll start with Bill. Bill had his hand up first, and then Mary Coffey is after Bill.
Okay. Thanks, Shannon. And I often take notes when people are speaking, just for myself. So if I'm looking down,
Oh, sorry, I muted you, Jill. Just, I wanted to fix it so people could unmute themselves, but
got it.
You're good.
I was just saying, if I take notes a lot of times during Q&A, so just, I am paying attention even if I'm looking down. So.
Thank you. All right, you're up, Bill.
Bill, go ahead.
Well, thanks so very much. I admit I have your book and I started reading it, but I haven't finished it yet. So if the answer to my question is in the book, I apologize. But you know, on this question of movement, and the idea that, well, even as Shannon just said, you know, building a cohesiveness and whatever, is not really the answer the opposite of that in terms of this. You know, by stating the obvious, the divine is incomprehensible to the human mind. Mm-hmm. So we all encounter the divine in our own way. As billions of human beings there's that many and many more ways to encounter the divine. the Raymond Burkes of the world have their own way and what have you. And so we will never, we can never have a cohesive, integrated matter to do that. It'll never happen. And in fact, attempts to do that throughout the history of mankind, results in all sorts of bad things in terms of, from the Crusades to burning heretics at the stake and all that sort of good stuff. And is not then the answer somewhat like what the community of St. Hildegard is, a small, intimate group that more or less mimics the early Christian communities, that immediately grew up, as a result of, the apostles and Paul's journeys and what have you. Is that not really what we should be attempting to go back to, those early Christian communities, and not these monolithic, cohesive, dictatorial types of entities that so many institutional churches, to include the institutional Roman Catholic Church, has become?
Yeah. So great question. We had a similar question, different but similar, I think, in its impetus in Berkeley. Was sort of like, why don't you just stop trying with the Roman? Like, do your own thing and be okay with it. So a few things I would say. I have said in other settings, I gave a talk to Future Church, for instance, last fall, and I really celebrated, honestly, the ministries that were coming out of the movement. Again, I'm going to use that word, but with quotation marks, because I think it is invaluable. I think the work being done by the women priests I have observed is serving so many people in ways that are healing, in ways that the church cannot. Whether because it's male priests or because the church is obstinate and patriarchal. I don't, take your pick. There are many ways that the community, like what you all have, is beautiful. The question then becomes, I think, one of power and who do you want to impact? So if you're content with small communities, with house churches, to use that analogy, great. That can serve. But house churches were never an end unto themselves. They were part of a larger thing, and I think we can definitely call the early church a at that time, in the early centuries, it was an opportunity, I should say, it was an opportunity to worship safely and hope that at some point the church would gain legitimacy, which it did with Constantine in 312. And from there on, I mean, this raises whole other questions, because Christianity moves from being sort of a marginalized sect to a sometimes oppressed locally sect to we're going to do our own thing, but we have an eye on a bigger prize. And ultimately Constantine leads to the legalization. And then by the end of the 4th century, Christianity is the religion of the empire. Well, then Christianity becomes a religion of empire. And I think I think that's maybe some of what you're reacting to, because this is the theme of my History of Christianity course. Is Christianity better when it is part of empire and it has power, or when it is serving the oppressed? Students pretty much always land on the second. So I hear you. And to me, it becomes about power and message. Like, do people ordained through the Roman Catholic Women Priest movement, organization, initiative want to sway things? If so, you need cohesion. If you're content not to, then you're right. I think individual ministries, small group ministries that are ecumenical, that are interfaith, I think that can also be good. I hope I've sort of addressed your question, because I think it depends on your motive. And I just wouldn't remove power from the equation, depending on where you want to go.
Thank you.
But it's a very apt question.
So Mary Coffey, and then Susan Russell, and then Roger. I'm just going through the line here. I see everybody's hands, but Mary, Susan, Roger next.
No, thank you for that. That was not my question, but I just kind of want to add a point. I think that we need to be responsive to how God calls us. And I was ordained in September and feel very much not a part of Rome because I've broken up with Rome because of how they treat women. And so I have a real hard time even considering myself within the Roman Catholic Church. So I consider myself independent Catholic. But I think that, I get that we would be more of a force in larger numbers. But for me personally, and maybe it comes down to each ordained priest, what are you called to do? So, and I don't think that's part of my calling. That might be part of Father Ann's calling, but that's certainly not part of my calling. So, and then you do lose momentum, but it's all about being obedient to how God is calling me to show up in the world, which I'm still figuring out. But my question was, you talk about in persona Christi. Can women stand in persona Christi? And you didn't address it. I'm only on chapter 3 of the book, but and maybe you address it later. But do you address in the book, or what do you think about Elizabeth Johnson's distinction between in persona Christi and in persona Jesus, two different things? Jesus was male, Christ is not. Mm-hmm. So how can you just say a little bit more about that? And clearly, women can stand in persona Christi if we move away from a gendered Christ.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Let me just address your first point. I 100% hear what you're saying about call. I think to tell, and I'm not telling anybody in RCWP what to do or any ordained woman what to do. The questions have been coming up a lot lately on where does this go from here? And so I've been starting to think about that. But in no way should anyone ever tell people who've been traumatized and abused by a system that it's their job to fix it. That is the opposite of anything I ever believe in. It's not feminist. I have a lot of problems with academia. In some ways, I feel like I've been traumatized by academia. There's a limit to how much I can try to fix it because it will drain all my resources. And I think what you call, I also call purpose. Like, I just don't think that's my purpose. So I hear you and affirm that. And I know there's a diversity of thoughts on that among the women. So thank you. And in no way am I suggesting take up your spears and go. If not, you're failing the church and all the women. I would never say that. So thank you for that. I do not take up Elizabeth Johnson, but so feel free to preach on this or write on this at some point in the future. I think she's spot on though. So the difference, I teach a Jesus class. And one of the things that really students are always like, oh, interesting. Like Jesus was a human man located in a certain historical context. And Christ is this whole other thing that has been defined a whole other multitude of ways over thousands of years of Christianity and by multitudes of communities. So I don't take this up. So I'm just going to riff very briefly. I think it's a beautiful idea. And yet if the church is going to come back to Jesus, which it does in Inter Insigniores, which is the 1977 document where they're like, well, ladies, we're sorry. We've never made this clear before, but you're not a guy. Jesus chose only men. He could have chosen his mother, but he didn't. So clearly he doesn't want you to be ordained. The church's arguments come back to the historical Jesus, even while in persona Christi talks about a Christ. The church itself, when it finally spoke out against the idea of ordaining women in the Catholic Church, used Jesus's male body. So there's a great piece I use in a lot of my classes. I think it comes up in the book in the Bodies chapter by Daphne Hampson, who is sort of a cranky British theist, who didn't identify as Catholic anymore. But she's like, we can't have a feminist Christianity ever because Jesus was a man. I don't subscribe to that. It's an interesting idea. It's an interesting thought experiment that I think Inter Insigniores invites. So yeah, I love that. I love the idea of parsing Christ and Jesus theologically. Historically speaking, doctrinally, when it comes to the church, I think it's not going to be a compelling argument to them. I think it is a ministerially, pastorally, sermonically valuable idea. But feel free to inject that into the book in a blog or something. I would love that analysis.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Nice to meet you.
Did I lose my spot here?
You're up to,
okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
I just wanted to say thank you for your book. I wish I'd known about it about 2 weeks earlier because I just finished a paper on women leadership in the early church and how it's sometimes used as a call to validate ordination currently. I'm actually a candidate with RCWP and excited about what you have written. This is one of my favorite topics for anytime I'm able to choose it in my studies at John Carroll. I've noticed that in some instances, there seems to be a little bit of more cohesion. And I noticed that Shannon invited ARCWP and independently ordained priests to be a part of the celebration she just did for the 20 years with Dagmar and Christine. And I see that as a very beautiful thing, but I'm just really excited to read your book and thank you so much for the work that you've done and sorry for the price that you've had to pay.
Thank you. I don't want to overstate any sacrifice I've made. It's really fine, but thank you. I hope it will continue to be helpful in complicating things for everyone moving forward. I'll just remind everyone, I'm a historian. So I'm thinking about what I just said to Mary, I'm like, oh, well, let's look at historical documents. So that's my default. I'm not a pastor. So there's still really great pastoral work to be done. I think I've laid a groundwork of history with, some textual analysis in there. So I'm still looking to you all from what you build with your ministries, which from what I've seen are incredibly rich.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Jill. So Roger, you're next, and then Roberta, and then Sue. You're muted, Roger.
Terrific discussion, and I'm going through your book and really having a great time with it. I want to touch on something that you've already discussed in a little bit different light, and please be patient with me on this. And before I ask these questions or ask for your reaction, understand that I have broken with the local Roman church over these issues, so you have an idea of where I'm coming from. But I live in a very conservative area, and I can just kind of see what's going to happen down the road. If someone, or how do you suggest I respond, I guess is the way to put it, to the statement that Jesus was male and only a male can remind people of Jesus or represent Jesus?
Mm-hmm. Was there more? You braced me for a very long question, so.
No,
no, that's it.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm pretty blunt.
Yeah,
I got two others to follow up on, but no, I'm pretty blunt. I'm just waiting for somebody to come up to me and say, Roger, you can't have a woman priest because a woman is a woman, and Jesus, not Christ, I understand. Jesus was a man, therefore you sin and all this, you're going to hell and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this is why Daphne Hampson, who I just mentioned in my response to Mary, is like, give up Christianity if you're a woman and you want any sort of feminism, because it's not possible. I'm not advocating that. I'm just stating that's a position in theology that's out there. So my first thought would be Roberta Meehan, who I know has her hand up, and I remember talking to Roberta probably 10 years ago now. I mean, to me, all this gender stuff, it seems so silly because we're in a time where non-binary is becoming a thing. Trans people are becoming a thing. There's some great queer theology and trans theology being written. Now, I say this as a scholar who engages with this stuff with her students. I would never walk into the bishop's office in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I live, and be like, hey, let's talk about trans theology, and expect a good conversation or anybody interested in anything that I would have to bring to the table. So I think there's so many approaches to this question that are probably going to fall on ears that won't hear, which is very frustrating. But some of the things that I think about in response to what do you say to that? Well, there's the question of, do we know that Jesus was 100% male? Because intersex, non-binary, all of that is a thing. You're probably not going to get very far with that. One of the things that that I have heard repeatedly is God really that limited? And are God's people really that obtuse? I mean, the suggestion that nobody could see Jesus in a woman suggests that the rest of us are really pretty dumb and that we lack imagination. And that's absurd and hurtful. It actually, in many ways, you could spin it. I'm thinking now of spin, like it's more insulting to men to think that they can only see God and Jesus in that which they are. But the rest of us have this a gender dexterity around theology and Christology, where we can look and be like, oh, that doesn't look like me. I'm a cisgendered woman, but that is a priest who's male and reminds me of Jesus. I can get behind that. I mean, I think it's deeply insulting to the faithful to suggest that they can't see Jesus without that. There are many other great responses and retorts I've heard over the years, like Jesus was male, but he was also a first century Jew. Like, is that a requirement? He was also born of a virgin. Is that a requirement? Like, do our priests have to be born of virgins to, like, why is the line drawn? Am I making sense? You're making a lot of faces.
Well, yeah. Listen, I'm really enjoying this. So don't be offended by what I'm about to say. But some of these things about binary and stuff like that.
You're not there yet. Yeah.
This is rural Ohio.
No, that's why, I mean, I admitted that at the outset. It wasn't going to fall. It was going to fall on ears that would not hear.
Yeah.
I gave you my response as a scholar. But what about I mean, Jesus was male, but he was also Jewish. That's not a requirement. Jesus was male. He was also born of a virgin. That wasn't a requirement. Like, to me, I think you should throw the question back as, why is this the definition? Like, why is your definition based only on this one characteristic that happens to be a fraught one?
Because this is what I grew up with my entire life.
No, I know. Yeah.
I mean that would be the response. Okay. I mean, and the kind of the allied question is, well, he didn't choose Mary as one of the apostles. My response to that one is, of course he didn't. He was sending apostles out 2 by 2 into a very rough, violent world. No, he wouldn't send his mother there. He had his mother doing other things.
Yeah.
It's just a safety thing.
There are 2 great responses in the chat. So from Mary and Susan. Mary says, Jesus died at 33, so any older males are invalid. That's fair.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, right? The point is, what I'm saying, Roger, is when absurd theology is thrown at you, throw it back. This is now, again, I'm being more strategic, and I'm being more scholarly than I'm being pastoral, but because I'm not a pastor. But, you know, if someone says something absurd, make them defend the absurdity. It's going to be hard. Why is this the parameter? And I know that gender
it is the parameter, though.
But why? Make them define why.
Because
and
my God picture is of Jesus as a male, and I've grown up my entire life. Father Jones says that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I would be talking to a person that I'm not going to convince in any way.
You never will.
So it's probably just kind of sidestep the whole issue.
I agree. I think this is all the more reason that the iconography of what a quintessential priest is can be changed and disrupted, thanks to people like the RCWP movement, thanks to people like your priests, like Shannon. Like, all of this is changing the image, because the image that's in your head is a very strong one. I'll also say, in terms of apostles, I mean, yes, Jesus called the 12, but if you look at why the number of 12 is significant, it goes back to Judaism. And wasn't Mary Magdalene also an apostle? We have mention in the Bible of Junia. We have other apostles mentioned, female names mentioned. So there's no clear argument historically, if you look historically at things, not scripturally, not Catholic tradition, that we can't say Mary Magdalene was an apostle. I mean, she was the one who the witness to the resurrection.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So anyway, I think there's just if I were you and you were trying to really engage with this person who you're probably not going to convince, you pepper them with questions. One of my rules of teaching is questions focus attention. So you pepper them with questions that are good and thoughtful and provocative and maybe point to the absurdity, and they either shut down because they can't engage them, or you get them thinking. And the latter is the goal. Like you said, you're not going to change their minds, but I think there's plenty of great historical work and theology out there that has answered these questions about Jesus and the maleness of Jesus and what that means. So it's been engaged. So you can invite this other person to join that or not. They probably won't, but anyway.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Have fun. I mean, it's an absurd argument, so have some fun in response.
No.
Thank you, Roger. And we're going to follow up later, but I don't want to take away from
Yeah,
Jill's time.
I'm
gonna take that.
You will hear from me, Roger.
Fix that situation, please.
Yes. So I'll go with you, Roger. Yeah, you and Dolly are coming with me. So, okay. Roberta, and then Sue, and then Margie has a question in the chat. So Margie, we'll get to yours after Sue, if that's okay, but we'll do Roberta first, and then Roger, if you wouldn't mind putting your hand down, that'll move Roberta next.
I do. No, I will. How do I do it?
Just hit the reactions again. I don't
okay.
think I can do, yeah. Okay. Oh, here, I can do it for you.
I see it. Okay.
All right, you're up, Roberta.
Hi, Roberta.
Hi, I'm Roberta Mann, RCWP. I was at the Danube, the ordination on the Danube in 2002. A fantastic experience, and the food was great, absolutely great. They had a wonderful meal. And I was ordained in Pittsburgh in 2006. And I can't believe it's been, what's it, 16 years. In 2 weeks, it'll be 16 years. Time flies when you're having fun. And, Jill, I could not remember that you had interviewed me. Somebody told me that you had, and I said, what? And yeah, you're quoted in her book. I said, what? I didn't know this. And so that I got a copy of what was said. I haven't read the book, but I got a copy of what I apparently said. I said, yeah, that's what I would have said but I don't remember.
It was April 10th and 14th of 2011, according to my appendix. So
yeah, somebody sent me the citation on it. Yeah, yeah, we've got to talk again. Seriously,
okay.
I've got some fantastic updates.
Great.
Anyway, while you were talking, I took notes, and I've got a whole page. And I'm a semi-retired professor of underwater basket weaving, so that means a whole page of notes. I could talk for a couple hours without taking a breath. But so I'm going to pick and choose what I have here. I am fantastically interested in what you're doing with the biology, because I'm a biologist. I went through PhD school in biology, and I call myself now a biotheologian. And I've been working on this idea, the polydimensional continuum theory. Totally.
I put it in the book. It's in the book. I put it in the book.
Did you cite me as polydimensional continuum theory?
Yeah, I think I did.
Well,
but carry on.
I've expanded the idea because everything has to do with the biology, just like you said. And you could give most of these bishops a test, and they couldn't pass a middle school biology test. Most of them, they really couldn't. And what's amazing is that the Catholic Church is a fantastic forerunner in so many fields of science. Look at what they've done with astronomy, with physics, with chemistry, all kinds of things. But when it comes down to biology, it's like they can't tell the difference between a plant and an animal. Of course, nobody can on a molecular level, but that's beside the point. But anyway, what I have developed this polydimensional continuum theory, which deals with the interrelationship between sex, gender, and relationship. I gave a Zoom talk to a college class in Montreal earlier this year. And if you'd like the video of it, I can give you the link.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, you have to excuse my hair in the picture, but that's all right. But the point is, everything's a continuum. It's not binary. It's a continuum, no matter what you're talking about. And once you get it in that level, then you can't delineate anything. You can't say yes and no, right and left, up and down. Can't say them. It's all up and down. And we all know that. Think about simple things, as height. Well, some people are taller than others, but you could make it's a continuum. Anyway, but I do want to talk to you about that. Okay. So I need to talk to you about several things that you've said, because I'm very interested in working on this.
Jill, would you be willing maybe to put contact information in the chat for if anybody wants to follow up with you afterwards, like Roberta? That would be great.
Yeah, I'll drop my email right now.
Perfect.
Okay, and anybody's welcome to have my email address and or anything else. It's fine. And even my website. I've got a website. It's incomplete at the moment, but it builds on this whole idea of sex, gender, and relationship. And I think you'll like it. You'll see part of it. You'll see the initial concept if you look at the video that I'll send you after I have a link to how to get it to you.
Okay.
Thank you, Roberta.
May I say one other thing real fast? Jill, I understand what you're saying about not being able to teach in a Catholic institution. I can't even think about them. They won't let me, but I'm qualified, but they won't let me think about it. And as far as even that and bishops, you probably, some of you know, I know a couple of you know, I wrote a book called The Trial of Judas Iscariot, and it's a play, and it's been put on 7 times so far as a play, and everybody likes it except the Catholics. Well, the Catholics do like it. I've put it on the Catholic Church. I've also put it on with the Methodists and and a few other religions. Even my insurance agent is a Mormon, and he likes it. So he can't find anything contrary-wise to it. But the thing is, I wanted to put it on at the church that I was attending, like slip in the back door and go to mass, that type of thing. And I tried to do it. I gave them a copy of the script, and the priest said, "We'd love to do it. It's a great play, but we can't." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We could put it on, but if the bishop found out, we'd be in really bad shape. So we can't put the play on here." So, this is right in the big city.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing, Roberta. There are a couple other hands up. I want to make sure.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm always being cut off because they talk too much. I have a propensity for verbosity.
Thank you, Roberta, for sharing.
Can I say really quickly?
Oh, please do.
Roberta, I found you're extensively quoted, and your website is in the notes of the book. So you're in there. This is one thing to warn people of. If you get the electronic version of the book, I don't think there are extensive footnotes or an index. So if you want the footnotes in the index, you need the hard copy. So it looks more academic when it's a hard copy because they include the footnotes in the index. But Roberta, yes, the polydimensional continuum theory is an extensive footnote. So FYI. It was one of my most memorable interviews, Roberta. So I definitely included it. All right, I'm done.
Thank you, Jill. It looks like Sue's hand's up and Richard's hand is up. And then I know we have a couple questions here for you too. So
Jill, I'm kind of the opinion that this thing about persona Christi is kind of a red herring. And the reason that I say that is because I think the statistics bear it out that most people are not having a problem with that concept. And I worked my whole and entire career in the Department of Defense. And I saw the same thing with women in the military, where first they couldn't be in the combat units. They didn't want them in the service academies. And then the non-government ones like the Citadel and VMI in Virginia, they simply didn't want women. And so we made all these intellectual arguments about why women couldn't do that. And then the walls came down and the women entered all of that. And really, there's probably not much left in the government, except there's in the military still kind of a rape culture that is a residue of what's left, where people say, oh, well, we were forced to accept women in all circumstances. And it's just like the last line of defense for them. And then certainly there's always going to be that minority percentage, that are traditionalists. And it's just how people are. Like Roberta says, it's a continuum. They're on the spectrum, and you're going to have people at one end, you're going to have people at the other, and you're never going to change everybody's mind. You just change the critical mass, and then over time, everybody comes around to that. So I really, and then there's always a few nasty men who feel like they have to speak for the church, and you see them in the blogs and they write horrible comments, and they're really truly a minority. But I guess the thing is, like, then what's preventing this from taking place? The women being in the image of Jesus. And when I look at it realistically, from the Catholic Church perspective, because that's where I come from, the easiest way to get around the problem is just to slide over to the Episcopalian Church. And, before I came across Reverend Shannon, that's where I was headed. It's just so easy. You just take up one day and move over, and then it's done with, and you're in the right place. And you have this little longing for Catholicism, but mostly it's satisfied. A lot of the women that I know stay because that's their family. That's their home in the parish church. And really, they can't see making the sacrifice because they don't think they're going to change things in their lifetime. And so it's like, I really have no problem. I want this, but I'm not going to give up what I have in my church family to make that happen. Okay. And the other thing is, people just really feel like there's not a movement afoot to make it happen, even though the majority of the people want it. So really, that's how I see the problem. It's in the execution of it, really not in the concept of it. And I know what Roger's dealing with, but he's really at, I think, the short end of the spectrum, where the traditionalists really, really want to hang on. So I don't know the answer, to what it is to make it happen when most people do want it to happen.
I'll just quickly respond. I love your comment. So many things going on. As soon as you were talking about the military, I remembered one of my favorite books that I was reading for research, and I just want to name it and give credit to this book. Mary Feinsod Kazenstein wrote a book called Faithful and Fearless, where she juxtaposes women in the military with women in the Catholic Church. And it's a great book, and I can't find the full citation, but it was called Faithful and Fearless. So I think you're really onto something with that connection, with that juxtaposition. The Episcopalian piece, this was one of the things that was really striking to me, was how many women in the movement, when I was studying it, had dabbled in Episcopalianism and then came back. But so many don't, to your point. I mean, I have so many family members who have left for the Episcopal Church. Yeah, so I absolutely, I hear that. It's an option that looks and feels like Catholicism. It's a lot of the smells and bells that we're familiar with, and yet it's more egalitarian and open. Yeah, I feel like your comment also reaches into larger issues in our culture and our society and our politics. I am deeply concerned about the loss of our democracy right now. This is something I worry about a lot. And I feel like that issue of certain people holding power, which is really moral wielding, is a very relevant and imminent, and it's not just in the Catholic Church. So I think a lot right now when I'm thinking about let's do something. This came up at the Danube 20th anniversary thing last week. Somebody stood up after the panel and said, "What's the plan? What are we doing? I want to help. Like, how do you organize us?" And there wasn't really a response. I think people are desperate for leadership that guides in the direction. I think that's where my focus on movement is coming from right now, because it's not just in the Catholic Church, but it is in the Catholic Church, but it's elsewhere too. So anyway, I'm just sort of riffing on what you offered, but I thank you for that. And I think a lot is on the line here. And it's not just a church, it's not just a religious identity. I think there's a lot here, and it's all the powers entangled in very similar ways, I feel. I hope I'm wrong.
Thank you, Jill. Looks like Richard's hand is up. Margie had a comment. Margie, I know Mary responded to you. I don't know if you want a further comment. And then Father Pete over here has a comment. And then it looks like Roger has a follow-up. So Richard first.
Yeah, I guess what I've got to say is more of a comment, follow up on what Roger's brought up and Sue and several things. I am having a rough time just getting my head around the fact that so many people are so negative, the comments that come out and so on. I just have a hard time wrapping my head around why, especially Jill, when you said that you had trouble doing research. You had people rejecting and saying, no, you couldn't do research here, research there. I just find that totally mind-boggling, but I guess I understand it. And there's been many things happening here in our archdiocese in Detroit where the bishop has come out and said, well, you can't have this meeting here because that so-and-so is being a speaker. And that's happened with a group that is here in Detroit called Elephants in the Living Room. And we've had some major speakers here that the diocese says that person can't speak in a Catholic facility. So we've had speakers in union halls and Methodist church and Episcopal churches and so on. And we've had some very famous speakers. I've mentioned before, Tony Flannery out of Ireland. He would, and I hadn't mentioned this before, but Jill, I would think that he would be for Ireland, the Roy Bourgeois of Ireland in terms of having been called on the carpet by Rome. But I won't go into too many more of those, but we've had many examples here in Detroit where they said, no, you can't speak in this church in a Catholic facility. So I'm just having a rough time wrapping my head around that. So
yeah,
I don't know if we have to make any more comments on it or not, but one other thing that stood out that really popped out to me is the mention in your book of worker priests, the history of worker priests and so on. And that whole idea really struck me quite profoundly, I guess.
Thank you.
Anyway, that's my comment.
Thanks for that. I won't say much. The worker priest idea, I think, is really fascinating, especially if we think about the church getting closer to the people in the pews and what they go through. I think there's a lot of opportunity in the worker priest model. It is also difficult, I know, for a lot of the women priests to have a full-time career in addition to what they're doing, serving a community. And yeah, I was surprised by the difficulty of getting into archives, but thanks to a community of other female scholars, mostly female, I've learned it wasn't me, it's the system. And I think the takeaway message is not just one of negativity. I would reframe it as there are certain people who will wield power in certain ways. And that seems to be diocesan and individual. So when you look at the scholarship that's coming out, why are women always writing on projects about women? Well, because we can. My initial project was going to be different. It was going to be archival, and it was going to be in St. Louis archives. I'm from St. Louis. I pulled out the whole. I went to your best all-girls Catholic high school. I did all the tricks and it didn't work. So I'm cool with how it turned out. But let's just name where the gates are, and it's not just ordination. But thank you for your comment.
Thank you, Jill.
Hi, Mary. I see people are having to leave, and that's totally okay. Nice
So
to meet you.
Margie's up next, and then Father Pete and Sister Dolly have a quick comment question on here, and then we'll get to you, Roger. So you're up, Margie.
Is this Margie's question about bishops?
Yeah, and also just the idea, and Mary kind of answered that, but the idea that why is it so important to think in terms of the physical body and not in terms of what Jesus did and said?
Yeah, your second question is really, I think, one of theological emphasis. This is where I get frustrated with bad theology. It's like, why would you just focus on the physical body when we have a person who in so many ways transcended the physical body? I mean, he survived death. Isn't that what makes Christ like our focus? And who among us is going to do that in our lifetimes? That's aspirational. So I can't answer that. I think is another form of gatekeeping. The bishop piece is a really interesting one when it comes to RCWP, because the group faced that question itself. Why would we ordain people to a hierarchy we don't like? Are we just replicating the problems that we see in the patriarchal church? But it's kyriarchal, to use a word that Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza used. Are we just doing not patriarchy, but kyriarchy? And we're just having structures in other ways. The ultimate argument for bishops in the movement became one of pragmatism. Like, we can't keep turning to these men hiding out, secretly supporting women's ordination to come out and ordain us when we need you to. So if we take that power, I mean, in some ways, this is so very magical, so spirit-driven, Holy Spirit. If we take that on ourselves as women, we can then pass on the Holy Spirit. There's this idea in the church, and this might be worth mentioning if folks aren't familiar with this, of apostolic succession, which is the idea that Jesus appointed apostles who then laid their hands on leaders, who laid their hands on, and ostensibly priests today can trace their lineage all the way back to the apostles. This is something that's done in other traditions too. Mormons do this, this passing on of authority through a laying on of hands. So it becomes a way for the movement to claim that they stand in a lineage that the church deems important. Whether it's important for them or not, I think it depends on the woman priest you're talking to. And that's part of that conflict within the movement. I hope that addressed.
Yeah, and just a sort of a side comment too, the whole idea of discussion, this whole discussion of the physical body of Jesus, part of that is, what did Jesus look like? And I'm thinking of all of the paintings that we have historically of this blonde, blue-eyed, slim guy. What if he was fat and bald? Or what if he looked like a typical Israeli? He was dark skinned with dark eyes and dark hair. It's just kind of, they're all part of the same thing. You see what you know.
I would encourage everyone to Google the real Jesus, because like 15, 20 years ago, some forensic anthropologists put out this image based on the skeletons of Semitic men living in the 1st century Palestine. What would Jesus have looked like if he were an average man? And the answer is brown skin, curly, sort of wiry hair, greenish brown eyes, probably about 5'1" or 5'2", probably about 120 pounds. Students are always floored when they look at the quote unquote real Jesus. Now, we don't really know what he looked like, but if he looked normal. And students have pushed back and said, well, how do we know he looked normal? And I said, well, how was Jesus identified in the Garden of Gethsemane? And some of them know, the kiss. And I'm like, exactly. Judas didn't say he's going to be the only 6 foot tall, blonde haired, blue eyed guy in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus presumably looked like everybody else. And this is what everybody else looked like. So, I mean, you're hitting on something that's so valuable, which is our idea of the embodied Jesus is already a construction based on what makes us comfortable as dominant Western culture. So, I mean, there's a lot of dismantling to do. I tend to take a historical view of doing that, but as some other comments, Roger's comment and other comments have pointed out, it's really hard to dismantle images once they're in our heads.
Of course.
So,
thank you.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Can you hear okay? The microphone? Okay, so Sister Dolly and then Father Pete, and it's about 10 to 2, so we're going to try to wrap up around 2 o'clock just so we don't keep you all day. Because we can keep, just asking you questions.
Well, I know everybody gets exhausted on Zoom pretty quickly, so I'll try to be
this has just been amazing, but Dolly's first.
Okay, well, I have not read your book yet. But I'm looking at it right now, and if Shannon lends it to me, I'll sit out on the dock and be reading it.
Sounds like a lovely place to read.
As long as you want.
But anyways, I'm just curious if any of your work has kind of covered the like the intersection of woman religious. I'm a Catholic woman religious, and the woman ordination movement, or if you have any comments on that.
Yeah. There's some history of the women's ordination movement in the chapter on history. I think it's chapter 2. So there's a little bit of that gets like, okay, so RCWP wasn't the first shot across the bow. Women had been working on this since Vatican II. Women organized into the Women's Ordination Conference, or WALC, in the mid 70s, and that grew. And then there are places, this isn't like a focus, but it's something I name, which is there is like a group of women within RCWP who came out of having been women religious. Christine Meyer-Lumitzberger, as you probably know, was herself connected to a women's order, women religious order. So it is a thing. I don't know if it's still a thing. I don't know, Shannon, if you know. I don't know if women who are gravitating toward the movement over the past 5-6 years are still coming in any way out of women's religious. It seemed to have been a thing earlier on to me, which also raises some questions about how close to Rome did the group want to stay in the first decade versus the second. But I don't know, Shannon, do you have any information on this?
Just in my experience, where there is intersection, it's women that had previously been in religious orders and then left.
Right.
Olivia's on the line. Olivia was a Carmelite, or she was on the line, a Carmelite. But I think, the consequences, in the last, especially last couple of decades, especially after Rome, in the last 10 years, completed their inquisition of the religious orders. There's so much fear of the consequences. I think if that's the case, it's more underground. It's not really visible.
Yeah, I had this very moving experience in 2010 at the Rochester ordination, RCWP, which was held at Spiritus Christi Church, but it was an RCWP ordination. And I was in the balcony, which was like a camera-free zone, because there were a lot of people hanging out there who would lose their jobs if they were seen to be supporting the movement. And I met a woman who had to be in her 80s, and she had been ordained as a catacomb priest. So there are women within the RCWP movement who have been ordained secretly, and they're not publicly doing priesthood, but they're privately doing, they know they're priests. And she is one of them. She would have gotten kicked out of her religious order, she told me, if she had come out as having been ordained through RCWP. And I said, in trying to understand, well, why do you do this then? Like, if you can't publicly have a ministry, why? And she says, well, I know that I'm a priest, and I think it will change in my lifetime. And I found this such a beautiful testament of faith. I can't see it. I mean, at this point, if she's still alive, she's got to be in her 90s. But she's always really stuck with me. But she was, I don't remember which order she was in. It's probably in my notes somewhere. I didn't identify her in the book in any way. So, but I know those people exist. RCWP used to list catacomb priests on their website. Like, there are people secretly being ordained, and a lot of them are women in religious orders.
And I see Olivia is still on. Olivia, I thought you were gone from us, but just real quickly, just to highlight there, Olivia, as many of you know, will be returning to the Philippines here in the fall to form a community. But Olivia is the first non-catacomb woman priest in the Philippines. There's one who's functioning in the Philippines in a catacomb mode. But
And she was a religious, that's
Olivia was a Carmelite. Olivia, I don't know if you want to unmute and say anything very quickly, but Olivia was a Carmelite at one point in her previous.
I was in the Carmel for 4 years, and then I went out because.
And you were diocesan religious at one point as well, correct?
Yes, also.
Trying to find her true calling, which I believe she's now found.
Nice to meet you, Olivia.
Thank you.
Okay, so then I know Father Pete has a question, comment.
I was just struck by what you said, especially in terms of that couple that you met on the boat from Boston and they didn't want to get involved. I think a lot of times we look at women priests more as a noun, something that tries to describe something that labels something, and some people are accepting of it, others, are very negative. I think the movement itself embraces it as a verb, you know, that this is an act of social justice and it's a movement that's going to change the church and the world. And we have to be careful not to fall into just labeling women priests as a noun that carries with it some dignity for some and, you know, a curse for others, but to help people to embrace it as a real movement of love and change.
I think that's beautiful. I think turning nouns into verbs can be so illuminating. And in this case, what does it mean to woman priest? It hits on the discipleship of equals idea that I think is at the core of the early movement, which is, again, I'm assuming many of you are familiar with this, the Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza idea of a discipleship of equals, sort of the democratization of religious power, spirituality, grace, all of that. So I love your comment. I'm rambling because I like your comment, so thank you.
Thank you, Jill. You have anything else? So just, Roger, I know you had your hand up for a minute there, and I'd like to give Jill an opportunity to wrap up. But, you know, one of the things that I think, just this looking forward to the future, something that comes up at our church council meetings quite frequently in different ways is that, you know, the community here at the Community St. Hildegard, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but I know it's been expressed, is that it'll be so beautiful the day that, you know, I've been told that we can just refer to you as a priest and not a woman priest, you know, and lose that label. And I think, you know, Roger, for those who may be coming from more of a fundamentalist background, you know, to pull the words of St. Paul that, you know, in Christ there is no male or female. And I think if we can really embrace that and just look at each other as priests, deacons, you know, whatever roles we fill, directors of religious education, et cetera, without assigning male, female, you know, straight, gay, et cetera, non-binary, and just, you know, I think that's for me anyways, the ultimate goal of where we're heading, but we have a lot of groundwork to do till we get there, for sure. But Roger, you had your hand up. I don't know if you had anything else to say, and then Jill, please, if you wouldn't mind wrapping us up. And I know I've thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you.
In the question I asked, I realized, and I apologize for this, I kind of ignored what I think is the social fact, particularly in this part of the country, that the Catholic Church isn't considered a theological entity in an awful lot of ways. It's familial, it's social, the golf league is a big deal, you know, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to add that perspective, and I didn't before, and I apologize for that. Done.
Thank you. One of the things I mentioned in the conclusion, as I'm thinking also about like that couple in Boston, or I'm thinking about my best friend who really read so much of the book, who 100% agrees with RCWP's values, but continues to go to the Roman Catholic Church nearby. Her kids are in the school because of what you just said, Roger. It's social. This is where our family goes. This is where the school is. This is where we do service in the community. Like, this is the organizing thing. And so if I've given any impression that I don't think that's still valuable, I've misspoken. I think it is enormously valuable, and it continues to be a pull of the church today. And I think the most successful RCWP communities I've seen, or communities of people who are ordained women, are those that are offering those sorts of things as best they can on a very small scale. But yeah, I mean, I'm with you. The church does more than theologize.
The quick question, okay, who says that Jesus, that the priest had to stand in the place of Jesus? Who said, where'd that come from? Real quick answer, it came from the Roman Catholic Church.
I don't think that's a quick answer, Roger, but I think that's probably Jill's thinking of Christianity.
I dropped the name. This is what you want to Google. Inter Insigniores came out in English in January of 1977. It came out in Latin a few months earlier. So this is where it's always fascinating to me. It was fascinating when I discovered the first time the church in like 2000 years is like only men can be priests was the 1970s. So if we ignore the context of the feminist movement, the women's movement, if we ignore the context of the Philadelphia 11 Episcopalian women, we're ignoring what's important. The church was acting theologically to respond to historical context. So Roberta, I dropped my my email in the chat earlier. I can do it again. anyway, I thank everybody for the conversation. Some of my takeaways or things to think through. I am stuck on the question that we got in Berkeley, what's the plan? What happens next? And I think that comes out of, somebody mentioned that it's a very Western question. I think it was Margie. Yeah, and I also think there's this strong desire in our country for people to want to get involved and they don't know how. Like, how do I help make the world better? How to make the country better? I feel you could frame it in language of call. People feel called, but they need that steering in that direction. And I think there's some of that. I would never suggest that RCWP's women have to step in and do that, but there's hunger for it if they decide to do it. I also know there's like a difference, so divergence between like the Father Anns who want to get out there publicly and wear the collar and really shake things up, and those who are more content to kind of sit back and lead their communities. But there is place for both in our world. Can there be place for both in RCWP, the organization that may resume being a movement? That's a question I have for the group that I hope they take up. But yeah, I guess my final word would be always look for the tensions. Like I identify transgression and tradition, but I think there's all of that in our world. So how do we bring those things together in ways that might be life affirming and faith and spirit growing, and might shed light on the problems we have and how to solve them? I think there's always tension. How do we inhabit it and move through it? But thank you. I'm really grateful. And thank you for really smart questions.
Yeah, this is an awesome
people who are interested.
This is a great community. I would highly recommend that you purchase the paper-bound book. Not only can you write it and mark it and yeah, all of that, but buy it and give it away as gifts. Certainly we want to support Jill's work and her research, but also I think the information in it is just invaluable, needs to get out. So Jill, thank you for providing us with this amazing resource.
Reverend Shannon. Yeah, it's really nice to meet all of you. You guys are doing really cool stuff I've seen just in the past month of getting to know you all. So, and you're lucky to have Shannon as your pastor. That's clear to me. And I think we've only been Facebook friends for a few months, but it's,
we've had
really
conversations.
Yeah, exactly. So
we've solved all the world's problems. We're just trying to figure out how to get it
ready. We're going to deploy them little bits. Yeah, but we've got it figured out.
Yeah. Jill, thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.